Welcome to our third session of our annual Rights of Way workshop. My name is Victoria and I am the Habitat Program Manager of our Rights of Way project at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And today I'm going to be guiding this workshop. And so just going to draw you to the next slide here. Let's see. Okay. So if you look at the bottom or the top of your screen, you'll see a black menu bar. And in that menu bar, you'll notice that there is an audio settings function on the bottom left-hand side. And if you're struggling with any audio, please just take a look at those settings and see if you're having, and just to make sure that Zoom is connecting with your system, whether it's your headphones that you have plugged in or with your computer or tablet. And if you're still having any audio or technical issues, feel free to send the panelists or us, the presenters, a message on the chat. The chat function should be in that menu bar as well. And then there's also a question answer function, and that will be used to ask our presenters questions today. So after each speaker, there will be some time for questions, and we will read those out loud. So when you type them in and submit, us as presenters will be able to see them. And once they're answered, they will be able to be viewed by everyone, including other attendees. So I just wanted to draw your attention to those. For the chat, please reserve that for any comments or questions to presenters about any technical issues, but any questions that you would like to have answered about the presentations or from the speakers themselves, please do keep those in the question and answers little component there. Okay, so to get started today, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. We are going to be focusing all on field techniques today, and we're going to be starting with Nancy Cain on Roadside Integrated Vegetation Management Programs. We'll be moving on to Tracey Etwell on how to build pollinator habitat. And then be going to Paula Berketo for native seed mixes, and ending everything off with Jennifer Hopwood on roadsides and monarch butterfly conservation. So to begin today, like I said, we have Nancy here. Nancy specializes in integrated vegetation management and pest control, and she brings agricultural and horticultural training to industrial vegetation management. So she has carried out projects on IVM and invasive weed control on rights of way, and as well as pest control and specialty crops and afforestation. She's managed the development of IVM programs for highways in Ontario as a research scientist with the MTO, and she brings us background to the presentation today on roadside IVM programs. So I'm going to pass things over to Nancy. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so she can take control, and just bear with us while we get this set up.
Okay, we'll just get this going. There we go. Thanks very much, Victoria, for that introduction. I have to say, when I sent that picture, I was thinking I should send my photo with my snowboard helmet on, all ready to be out on the slopes, because that's what I'll be doing for the next few weeks at the end of this very short year. But anyways, back to roadside IVM. So what I wanted to do is talk about roadside IVM and bring plants into it, and you'll see what we mean by the end of this. So integrated pest management is a system that started with horticultural IPM programs, and the key principles include monitoring, thresholds for control, multifaceted control of pests, and in horticulture programs, those are beneficial insects, and then targeted control that doesn't harm these beneficials because they're part of the whole program, and then revision and planning for the next cycle. And there were a lot of studies done probably since the 1950s, starting in Pennsylvania and New York, and then continuing with work in Quebec, looking at natural vegetation communities on power line rights of way that were resistant to tree and weed invasion. And these include shrubs and short tree communities and old field communities, things you actually might sometimes think of as weeds on roadsides, but these are actually good guys. And then combination control programs for weeds and brush in these situations. So in a power line, then you would have, they also brought into the whole concept this idea of zones within rights of way. So on a power line, you would have the wire zone, and under the wire zone, you needed the shortest vegetation. And then beyond that, you would have the border zones where you could put up with taller vegetation, but still not tall enough to fall over onto the power line. So integrated vegetation management then is built on all these programs, and we're monitoring weeds throughout the program. That's the target of our monitoring. We're using multiple control options, and that can be controlling operations and using the best timing to reduce costs and improve activity. Different types of control like mechanical and manual, targeted herbicide control, biological control, and the whole idea of using competitive plants to help reduce weeds and brush. And then the final phase, and it makes it a cyclical program, is evaluation, updating the program, and then starting all over again. And every municipality or road authority has concerns, pretty similar concerns about weed and brush control. One of the guiding things is safety of traffic, of course, and visibility of different issues like visibility and intersections or going around corners, visibility of the side of the road and whether it falls off or not, or guide rails, things like that. Maintenance of guide rails and the shoulder surface. And in those zones, we actually need control of all the plants. It doesn't matter what they are, what their benefit is. They're not a benefit at all in these areas. And then complete control for safety along the whole shoulder. And then tall vegetation height concerns within wire zones when we have shared rights of way. An example of that is on a roadside here, so you can see the safety clear zone right next to the road. A zone where you have no real height concerns with vegetation, and then a wire zone where we have height concerns on the shared right-of-way. The targets for weed control on roadsides are height related, as I talked about, so all types of vegetation, and then specific species like poisonous species. Poison ivy has been the classic one, you know, when we have kids waiting for buses and things like that. Wild parsnip, a poisonous weed, especially a problem in southeastern parts of the province, but all over the province. And then weeds with an ecological concern, such as dog strangling vine, which is present on a lot of roadsides. And then a lot of these are noxious weeds, and then you also have agricultural concerns that fell into that as well when we're near farm areas. Historically, roadside vegetation management has been a little different than an IVM program. There's a regular program of maintenance, things like shoulder grading, which is still used to control weeds along the shoulder, mowing fence line to fence line, and essentially all operations going fence line to fence line. So herbicide control for broadleaf weeds, and these were done in a regular control program in regular cycles, maybe a third of a property or a region every year. So you had a program over 3 years, and then continuous control along guide rails and shoulders, and continuous control of weeds from start to finish. And then herbicide control and what I would term probably heavy cutting of woody plants. We'll explain that a bit later. So roadside IVM programs instead have a number of steps, and I'm going to go over some of those different steps. The first one is just setting what the long-term goals are. I've talked about some of those already, safety concerns along the road, using a multi-tooled solution program, and then the vegetation goals, having a zoned roadside management, using competitive vegetation, using methods that protect existing desirable vegetations as much as possible, and improving those areas with plantings, which is one thing we're talking about today. Monitoring in integrated vegetation management is specifically monitoring of weeds. What species are there? Where are they located, and how dense they are in these different areas? And this is necessary for planning work, for contract management, And then for quality control, was the control effective? And at the end, then we want to look, was it effective? Do we need to change what we're doing, do it differently, or we just continue in the program? So that type of cyclical. And here's examples of zones of competitive species. So this shows your bare shoulder, your guide rail, and normally where vegetation is kept completely clean from under the guide rail. And then a safety clear zone out to a certain point, a point where we're not worried so much about the height of vegetation, and along the tree line, and then the wire zone. And here the same thing, a wire zone and the different zones of vegetation. But you can definitely see that zoned approach. So the incorporation of competitive vegetation, these would be desirable species competitive with weeds and brush. And they would be suitable in different zones based on the height threshold. So that's our use of thresholds in this type of a program. And within any region, a road manager would need to develop lists as identified, or they may be able to go to botanical sources for lists, and then monitor and record these over time. So as well as monitoring weeds, maybe to have a monitored area of where all these plantings are. And we're working to encourage these plants to thrive and to spread. When we're doing maintenance, if it's manual or mechanized maintenance, protect areas that are 5 meters or larger, or if manual maintenance, on foot maintenance, 1 meter or larger. And the other part that relates to what we're talking about today is that many of these species are suitable for planting and seeding. So having these lists are very valuable. I'll give you examples of how these areas might look. This is an area of a perennial fern, and there's it's a different perennial fern species, which are a different group of plants than you might think. And you can see how it's not even, and there's clumps here and clumps there. So it's sort of not even over the whole site. Raspberry, which is very competitive against tree invasion, and old field species, and this would be aster and goldenrod mixes. And one thing I show these slides is that it's good to, over time, to identify these, to get help with identifying. This is flat-topped aster, which you don't normally find in other parts of the province in big solid stands like this. So it's kind of interesting. And then also observing how they're working. This is a raspberry stand on a zoned roadside. You can see the nice zoned layout here. And with all the seed falling from this maple tree, look how effective the raspberry is in keeping out these trees. It doesn't mean that none will get through, but it's certainly a help in not having to control them. So optimizing control measures is another part of IPM. So for example, along shoulders, working with residual herbicides that you could make one application a year and have control over the whole year. And then using selective or directed control in the safety clear zone for any tall vegetation that's of concern. Beyond the safety clear zone, then the right-of-way is going to be broken into sections of control based on need. And there's going to be sections, there's still, no matter how far we get, always find areas where we're going to need continuous control. But then all of a sudden we start having areas where there's only spots of control needed, or areas with no control. And the control may be continuous. So in other words, you might have one whole highway where you're going to have control, or one section of a highway, but you're also going to have continuous control because of how dense the weeds are. Oh dear, okay, I'm gonna have to go. Yikes. Sorry about that. Escape. Here we are. Sorry about that. I'm just going to go from current slide and get back to where we are. My apologies. That was my fault there doing that. Okay, so weed monitoring, as I mentioned, and mapping is a big part of this. And this can be done separate from weed control, getting separate consultants in, so we know where the weeds are and how dense they are, and the different size squares show different densities. And then following up with post-control monitoring and evaluation. So this is an example from SD&G United Counties showing a road that was untreated versus one that was treated, and showing different types of, you might have continuous control in an area here and you're going to have more spot control there. And so that's how you'd use that for planning. And then the goals of minimizing impact on competitive vegetation works in a number of ways, selecting herbicides that don't damage grasses or some specific perennials, and then directing it to control target weeds. And when we're doing weed control with trees, getting the trees, identifying them when they're young and controlling them when it's easy to do that, which minimizes disturbance of the vegetation and minimizes use of heavy equipment that's going to disturb vegetation. So just to give you some examples, you have small patches of wild parsnip, so you can do spot control in this area. And with a tree, you could just do a spot application right on this tree, or even a stem treatment, which uses less herbicide. So just some different spot methods. However, if you have a right-of-way like this, and this is along Highway 401 with a continuous stand of wild parsnip, there's no way you can do any spot application. You have to control the whole right-of-way right up to the fence line to get control. And in a site like this is along a section of Highway 7 in Eastern Ontario. There was a huge field of wild parsnip right beside the road here. So no matter how good control you get here, you're going to have seed continually coming in and need to have continual control. In terms of brush control, getting in when the stem is smaller means we can use brush saws to cut it, and it's going to regrow and have a little tree on a big root system, so you need to actually do a spot application of herbicide to make sure that plant has been killed. But it's a very small spot on the whole right-of-way for controlling that tree. So looking at some of the steps of monitoring IVM, we're going to monitor weeds throughout the whole program, use multiple control options, follow-up monitoring to evaluate programs, and then revise and plan for the next cycle. So I just thought I'd finish with a few comments on herbicide control in planting, since we're going to be continually talking about planting, is that the herbicides used, well, all herbicides have a time period after application until there is no impact on transplants or seed germination. So if you're working on a site where they need to do some control, then you might want to know how long this is, and it's not usually tested for unless it's in crop use. So if you speak to the company representative, or if you're able to find crop labels with the same active ingredient, you may be able to find that information. And sometimes speaking to the company reps, they will have observations or experiences they can share. And for example, I've used Launtrol 360 on areas where we're doing replanting and reseeding. And seeding can be done the year of application, but we need to delay transplanting until the following season is the best. So that type of information is very useful. With no information, then you may just have to try yourselves, try some small areas, try seeding later the same year and observe if there are any effects, or try planting the same or following year and observe if there are any effects, and try different times if you want to, if you do, find out how far you can push it. Another option is to talk to the people doing the maintenance and the road people, and ask if they could do spot control treatments right where you're doing your work, and then you can plant and seed in between these treated weeds. Or another option would be to switch to a glyphosate product where there's a very brief waiting period for seeding and planting. So there's just some different options and things you might want to consider if there's active control going on where you're planting. Planting needs If you're in an area where there's perennial weeds that are going to interfere with the establishment of what you're planting, there may be a need to do some vegetation control before planting. And with a non-residual product like a glyphosate product, it's most effective in the fall or the mid to late summer. And it's the best time for perennial control. Because those are what you're really going to be worried about, is perennial plants that are going to interfere with your planting. And the good thing is there would be no impact on the seeding or the plant, and you could probably plant after a few days. The big catch is you need to do this a couple of weeks before you want to disturb the site, and you may need to retreat. But it's well worth it. I've done lots of plantings on roadsides, and I can tell you it's definitely worth that step. So, in summary, is that when you're planting with roadside IVM programs, I hopefully understand the program a bit more, that new plantings are going to become part of that IVM program. And it's challenging when there's weeds in the planting site or when they come in, but controlling them will benefit the establishment of your planting, and weed control is part of the program in the long term, just as your new planting is. So with that, if there's any questions, Victoria?
We have a few questions here for you. So the first question is, what herbicide do you use for spot control of woody plants in particular?
For spot control. Well, there's a number of different products. I'm not going to go into specific products, but there's a number of different products registered in the province for spot control. Um, and some of them are for foliar application to the leaves and the foliage. Some just go right around the stem, so it just sprays right around the stem, and then it translocates up and down. Or some are registered for those cut surface treatments. So those would be all spot applications. So there's quite a number of herbicides registered for that. Now, I don't really want to go into specifics with herbicides because it's better to get the updated recommendations at that time. So,
Okay. And we have another question that's asking, when a new road is developed, what is the vegetation plan? Can some of these noxious weed problems be avoided?
that's an age-old question. I would ideally like to see, before they do anything, that they go in and use control measures to get rid of all the weeds that are there. But typically the soil is removed. I mean, you see these big soil piles that they put at the side. They clear all the topsoil off and store it in a pile, and those get weeds on them, and then that's re-spread out, and you have weed seed in plants. So the short answer is no, and it would be nice. And then the problem is then they're in the same position of reseeding and replanting and dealing with weed issues. So definitely a big issue. Paula may have some more comments about that.
Okay, and our next question is, in using raspberries as a barrier, is there any issue with wildlife on the road?
Well, there's always issues with wildlife on the road. All those stands that I showed you were naturally growing, so I assume there was no issue at that point. And I guess you could say they would be concerned about bringing wildlife on the road, but wildlife come on the road to feed on grass areas. Certainly, they burn like prairie planting, for example, in southwestern Ontario. Historically in the prairies, they burn them so that the deer would come into the prairie areas. So it's all part of that. But that's definitely a concern. But I don't think what you plant is going to make a difference with that one way or the other. It's going to bring them on.
Okay. And what is the best place to find the recommended herbicide for specific applications?
Like to find out what herbicides there are. There are provincial documents that list the herbicides that are recommended. So that's one. Like if you go to the OMAFRA site, they have documents with those, lists of those herbicides. And then the PMRA has a web search site that you can go and search. If you put in a specific weed, you can actually get herbicides come up. You'd have to sort through it that way with different different methods that way.
Fantastic. And those are the questions that we have for now. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. It's been really wonderful.
I will stop sharing.
Okay. And I will share my screen. So let's see how easily I can get this transitioned. I think by the end of this workshop series, I'm going to be an absolute pro. I'm hoping, at least. Okay, wonderful. So up next, we have our very own Tracey Etwell. Tracey is our restoration ecologist on the rights of way and the grassland project teams at CWF. So she has extensive experience with inventorying, planning, and restoring terrestrial habitats. She understands the plant community dynamics needed to support Monarch, and she's also spent a lot of time exploring the natural history prior in her master's field work in the Carolinian Canada region and northward to the Bruce Peninsula. She has been providing a lot of key expertise to our partners through our own Rights of Way project. And so she is here today to talk a little bit more about building pollinator habitats. So I'm going to pass things off to Tracey now.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen here. Share. Awesome. I think we're good. Can you see?
So we can actually see your notes here. So if you want to exit and join again, just from the beginning, and then that will hide.
Okay, so share screen again.
So just make sure that everything is exited outside of the PowerPoint. So you're just showing from the PowerPoint and then join the slideshow from there.
Okay.
There we go. Yep.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction there, Victoria. Yeah, I am the restoration ecologist on this team. And my job is to give you a bit of the nitty gritty on the how to build pollinator habitat. I have a lot of detail in these slides, so I probably will go fairly fast just to cover it all. So just to let you know, it will be recorded so you can go back and refer to it again. And just to kick off, I'm going to ask Victoria to load our little quiz to get started. Okay, so I'm going to ask our attendees here to take a moment and go through the little quiz and see what your answers are going to be. So hopefully we have enough time here. Everyone's gotten a chance to respond.
Let's just give a few more seconds. I see them coming in.
And so my intent here is to get you thinking, and I'm not going to give you the answers right away. I'm going to let you follow the presentation and see if you can find the answers, if they will come to you right off the top.
We still have answers coming in, which is, so we'll just give a few more seconds for everyone to finish. Okay, I'm going to end the polling.
All right. So I'm going to begin through my presentation here. And as I said, hopefully you can see where you can find the answers to the quiz if you don't already know. I'm going to assume in this presentation that everyone has a sort of beginner knowledge. So there may be some things that are already existing knowledge to some of the botanists maybe in the crowd. So as a background, we have about 5,000 species of native bees in North America. And all of these pollinators provide very important ecosystem services and crop pollination. So both from the side of having our food crops to feed people, as well as support our ecosystems. And habitat decline is thought to be the #1 factor in this biodiversity loss. And if you think about Canada's entire country, we have over 1 million kilometers of roadsides. So if you thought about how every kilometer of these roads could be restored to pollinator habitat, what a great impact that would have. So that's kind of the whole point of our project. Oops, went a little too far. Okay, so to kick off for planning, step 1, I'm going to throw out a bunch of questions to get you thinking. If you're at the stage where you're just beginning to plan a project, these are all things that you're needing to think about and have discussions with on your team. So first one, what is your budget? Is this going to be a very low cost budget? Do you have lots of money to work with? Secondary, what area do you have to work with? Is it a small site? Is it a large site? We often recommend that people get started with a small trial site just to start to get the feel for it and get an idea of how it works. Thirdly, what people? So do you have a team of staff? Do you have volunteers? Who can you recruit to help you? What kind of equipment? If you're a municipality, you probably have lots of heavy machinery that you can get a hold of to help you with the planning or the monitoring or the maintenance. And then the last question, what's your timeline? Are you looking to produce something fast and furious and a very dramatic, showy presentation, or do you have the time to slowly plan it out properly and produce it over 3 years, say, to get a good bang for your buck? Setting expectations is really important. Also, considerations in the planning stage, what's growing there now? Is the site you're looking at, is it full of weeds? Is it going to be a major undertaking to get rid of all those weeds, as Nancy was talking about? Also, on the flip side, if it's a beautiful remnant site full of rare plants, that's probably not the best site that you're going to want to do work on. Will you or can you use herbicides for weed control? So some places have very firm mandates about what herbicides they're willing to use. In some cases, the public is not so receptive on herbicides, so that might be a consideration in your project. Other things to look at, things like your rainfall. How much rain do you typically expect in a season? That's going to impact what species you pick to put in your planting. What is the soil type? So do you have a lot of clay in your soil? Do you have a mixed loamy type? Do you have a lot of sand? That's going to affect the soil moisture. And then likewise, the plants that are going to be happy living in that soil type. Like I said, tending to be wet or dry. So you might pick more dry prairie kind of species in a dry sandy soil, and more wet sites, you're going to pick more species that are happy having wet roots. So step 2, schedule. So as Nancy just mentioned to you, we were talking about when you spray, you sometimes have to think about the schedule about when you're actually going to be able to put plants back in the ground after you've sprayed. There may be a waiting period. So that's one consideration. Also, your soils are going to determine what the seeding approach is going to be. So if you have clay soils, spring is a better time to seed, and that would be recommended to either broadcast seed or drill seed, and I'll explain those on a separate slide. If you have more loamy soils, you're more likely to want to do broadcast or drill seeding, and that can be fall or spring. So obviously, if you're going to order seed, say for a spring planting, you've got to be able to plan that out, order it in time, and get everything organized for the seeding event. Fall is often a recommended time. It's really good for our native species because it provides something called winter stratification. So a lot of native seeds need that winter treatment. So they need to freeze with the winters that we have, and then they open because they have cracked seed coats, and then the moisture in the spring will slowly infiltrate and then germinate. Some species, even if you planted them, say this spring, they're not going to germinate till the next year. So that's something to consider in terms of expectations of what you're going to see. Maybe not the first year, might be the second year. So as I mentioned before, there's a couple of different seeding approaches. So there's pros and cons to all three. So you've got things like broadcast seeding, which is the standby, go-to approach. It's inexpensive, it can be easily done. It's good for species that have really tiny seeds, but you need to have a seed bed that's entirely prepared and is ready to go. And it can be difficult to get an even spread of seed across that site. It also could be done well with volunteers. So moving on to drill seeding. So drill seeding is great. It helps get the seed right down, gets good soil contact, and it's done with a machine, so everything is very calibrated, but you might end up having that look of a calibrated checkerboard pattern of planting, so that might be something you want to consider. It can be good for places where you have light stubble, so things like corn residue or wheat. You don't necessarily need to get rid of that material entirely because the drill seeder will get down below that. And then it is expensive, so that's the one thing, it costs a little bit more. And you have to have a special operator to come and do that work. And then the third option is hydro seeding. So that's when a spray is made of water, mulch, and seed, and then it's sprayed and put on a certain site. So it's really good for places where you have slopes, wet areas, where you have a roadway maybe that the hydro seeder can get up close to. So some of the downs of that, it can be expensive and the seeding rate is hard to control. If you have too thick of a mulch put down, that seed to soil contact is not going to be achieved. So you might not get as much seeding as you would like, and then you might have to come back and reseed. So these are all the things to consider. So more on the seed mix. So some guidelines. It's really, really important to have native species. Your native species are adapted to the weather conditions. They're adapted to living with the other species that are found in the area. They can create their own mycorrhiza with the soil colonies. And you just are going to have better success with those versus trying to bring a species from another area. You could also introduce something that's a little more aggressive than you want that might take over your site. And so some of the ways that you can get native lists are from your county. You can Google like the county list of, and you'll often get a plant list from some of your local botanists. Also your conservation authority, if you're in Ontario, often has lists of native plants. Secondary, you want to aim for species from local growers as much as possible. So if you go onto any American seed grower, they'll have all kinds of seed mixes and they all look really great, but some of them are not native and some of them are cultivars from other places. So I've seen seed mixes from like New Hampshire and Texas, and there's no guarantee those plants are going to grow here, and they're might not even survive the winter. So those things are really important. And so for your actual mix, you want to have about 75% forbs. So when I say forbs, I'm talking about wildflower species, and then 25% grass. And the reason that it seems really heavily onto forbs is because we're building pollinator habitat. This is not prairie or grasslands or any other kind of ecosystems. This is not like recreating a community. It's designing a meadow specifically to support those pollinators. So all the research is saying you really need to heavily focus on the forbs. Yes, the grasses are there. They do provide all their habitat functions, but you don't want the grass to take over and dominate the forbs. So for instance, big blue stem, they're finding a lot of places, even if it's in a small percentage in your seed mix, it can take over and dominate. And then you're left with a field full of big blue stem, and then you have to decide what to do next. And also 30 species of forbs, that's a nice guideline. They're showing if you can reach that many species over the length of your project, you're going to maximize out the number of pollinator species that will be found at your site. So that's something to look for. Of course, in Ontario, we have, I would say, a smaller native seed market. So it's often a challenge to get native seed mixes that are really high. But every year there's more people asking for native seed mix from our suppliers. So the more demand, the more that's going to develop. And then my last point on seed mix, aim for species that bloom early, mid, and late season. So when the pollinators come out in the springtime, they're looking for food resources. Often there's very little available. The forbs haven't always come out. So if you can include in your seed mix some species that you know are going to come up and bloom in early May, June that can support those pollinators, that's great. Also, you want to have the mid-season and then into the late season, so fall species. So that's actually the season that's the easiest to accommodate. All the goldenrods and all the asters and everything that blooms beautifully in the fall, those are all supporting those pollinators. Some other guidelines: avoid non-natives and weed species, even if it's grown maybe in the prairies. I've seen some things like that. It's not necessarily adapted to Ontario. Consider a thinner in your seed mix, which is something that kind of helps spread out the seed mix, keeps it consistent, keeps the mix even. And you can also consider like nurse crop species such as millets and oats. And what those species do is they just help hold the site in the first growing season while those other species are getting going. So you won't have as much issue with the weeds creeping into those spaces between the time when those forbs can get going. And use a seed calculator whenever possible. This is kind of a new idea that's coming out. Idea is using math to look at all the different aspects of your mix to come up with the best mix. Your seed supplier will often give mixes, but it's often good to dig deep, and I'll show you some examples of that. Keeping in mind that species have different weights, and so just by saying I want 10% of this, 5% of this, it's not incorporating the weight of those seeds. So you have some flowers that are super, super tiny, so if you do it by percentage, you're going to get a way much higher volume of that particular species. And here we go. Here's use PLS, so that's pure life seed. And where you can, it's a great idea to use pure life seed. And I'm going to show you an example. So pure life seed refers to the amount of pure life viable seed in a load of bulk seed. So it's the amount of seed in the lot that's capable of developing into seedling. So this is a bit of math here, but it's basically at the end of the day, it's looking at how much of that seed that you have, how much is it viable? So not all the seed is in a whole lot, not all 100% of it's going to grow. So you want to know how much of it is actually viable. In your entire mix, you want to know how much of it is actually weeds, how much of it might be other species. Maybe you've got some oats in there, you've got some brome seeds in there. So that's going to reduce the amount of the species that you're actually looking for. So basically your PLS is going to tell you if it's high or it's low. So if it's too low, you're going to need more seed to compensate to get that number of native forbs that you want in your mix. If it's high, you can actually reduce your amount. So that's one way that you can possibly save costs on seed mix, because in certain situations it can get expensive. The only problem with this is to get some of these numbers, it means that some of the growers would have had to submit seed to a lab where they measure and they test these things. And each test can be quite expensive, and it also takes a large volume of the seed to actually conduct some of these tests. So especially in the Canadian seed market, it's something, again, that we're starting to ask for. The more you can ask for it, then there's a demand for it. But we can't necessarily eliminate a grower if they don't have this information. So here's just an example seed mix for you. So I've got a whole bunch of species, the common name, and then you'll see this weight thing again. So each species in that entire list has totally different number of seeds per ounce. So that's the weight. And then the price per ounce is going to be wildly different. Some things are super cheap, some things are more expensive. So if I just use that one column that has percentages, I have no control over what the total cost is or of the number of seeds I'm actually getting. So, but it will, if I use the PLS on the far right column, then it will tell me what my PLS is needed. So if I want 10% Canada Wild Rye, I know that I need 613 ounces of that seed to make that number. So, and you see other species that are super low, like New England Aster, I only need 3.44 ounces to make 1% of the seed mix. So I know this might seem a little complicated, but it's a way to look at your seed, and then maybe you'll make decisions. Okay, maybe I want to reduce the one that, if I need 613 wild rye, maybe I want to reduce that. Or maybe it's okay, it's $1.50, it's not adding that much more cost to it. But maybe I'll go down to my wild lupin that's $60 an ounce, or the rough blading star and say, oh yeah, I only need 26 ounces of that, but it's $55 an ounce. So maybe I want to make a little bit of a change there. So also a lot of people do plan a seed mix based on seeds per square meter or square foot if you're American. So the idea of that is that if you can imagine your site and you imagine a square meter, how many of those, each of those species would you like to see in there? So how many common milkweed would you like to see in every square meter, or every brown-eyed Susan that you might want to see in that? So it's a bit of a easier way to visualize what you expect. Obviously, you're not going to get that exact number in every plot. Some are going to be higher, some are going to be lower, but at least it kind of gives you a goal or an objective of what you want to achieve. So again, here's the Pure Life seed. And then I've shown you here in a column number of seeds per square foot. So in this example, we're going to have about 3 lavender hyssops in every square foot of our meadow. So then you can stop and think, okay, is that how I want to see this site represented? Is that plant the one I want to see the most dominant? Because out of this whole list, other than Joe Pyeweed, it's going to be the species that shows up the most. So assuming these are all native, it's not a bad thing that one is more than the other, but it's just something to keep in mind. And then also you can see in the far column again, the price per seed. So that's going to influence your bottom line when you purchase. So some more tips. Always include common milkweed, which is our common milkweed that supports monarchs. And if you can find one of their species, so swamp milkweed if your site's a little more wet, butterfly weed if it's a little more dry. Avoid the tropical milkweed. This is sold in a lot of garden centers. It's not a native plant to Eastern Ontario, and we don't really know how it affects milkweed, so it's not one to play around with. Ordering your mix as soon as possible. A lot of these growers are very small in size. If you can order your mix early on, there's often a chance they can pull in, if they don't have the exact species you're looking for, they can look at other growers and combine them to make a custom mix for you. Or it's possible they can actually harvest in the fall and grow out that seed for you. Excuse me. So that's a great thing. So you can get a very, very customized mix versus you call them up on May 31st and say you need a seed mix in June, on the 15th of June. You play the game because you may find what you need, but there's a good chance that you won't. And you'll just have to get what you can find. Asking suppliers about where their seed comes from, again, if they're collecting seed from producers in the States, in Texas or Arizona or even into New Hampshire, that seed might not do very great in our conditions. And ask if they have any data on the germination, seed certificates, and then thirdly, how they clean it. So it's really important when seed collectors go out and collect their seed and they bring it back in, they have to go through a number of steps to clean the seed. So if they're very persistent and they have procedures in place for how they clean that, you're going to get a much better successful planting based on the fact that those seeds are clean and they're ready to go. There's not a lot of chaff left over, a lot of fluff, a lot of extra gunk on top of those seeds. And if you're using something like hydro seeder or drill seeder, that's really, really important because it's going to go through that drill seeder, get clogged up with all the other material. So seeding rates, so we often recommend between about 5 to 10 kilograms per hectare. A lower rate for drill seeding and a little bit of a higher rate for hydro seeding. So this is where your seed calculator comes in. So you can build your mix and then you can have a drop down to be able to adjust based on the seeding method that you're using. And keeping in mind, we want some gaps for plants and we want some bare ground. So bees also need spots on the ground to go in the earth and dig and lay eggs. So we don't want it to be a solid mass of plants from the start to finish. So implementation, so site prep. So this is focused on sort of larger blocks. Like if you have a large, say 5-hectare site that's either square or rectangular, it's often recommended that you use something like a Roundup Ready corn or soybean for a year. You seed it, you grow it, you do the pesticide control that you would normally do on that crop, harvest it in the fall, and then you can go in and seed with your pollinator mix, either broadcasting or drill seeding. So you've done the extreme site prep that you need that Nancy mentioned. If you go through and you make sure that site is really, really clean of weeds, you're going to have a much better success and less hassle dealing with the weeds that come up in the years after. A silver approach is harvest with another crop, and then seed your site. And then if you have stubble left over, use your drill seeder in fall or spring. And then bronze is you're going to need to do some mechanical efforts to remove grasses and other unwanted species. And preparing that clean bed is really, really important. And often a two-part approach is recommended. So first you might mow it, and then you might do your herbicide to prepare. So monitoring and management, this is something else you need to consider from the beginning. Sleep, creep, and leap. So the first year, those seeds are going to sleep. There's not going to be a whole lot that's going to happen. You're going to come out the next year and go, geez, this was a failure. What is this site? And people driving by are going to think, what's going on here? So this is important for the education communication side of things, where you have to manage expectations. Second year, those plants are going to be putting down roots, and you might start to see some growth coming up on the surface. And then your third year is your leap year. So that's when you're going to see everything come out really gangbusters, and it's going to be really exciting. But often you need to have patience and let that process happen. And you're going to think about how you're going to manage those weeds that are going to come up, because there will be weeds. Even your best methods, you're still going to have weeds. Are you going to do a high mow afterwards? Are you going to have staff come out and hand pull? Are you going to spot treat things? Could you do a burn to control weeds? How are you going to measure your success? So that's something to think about from the beginning. And we are using the pollinator Habitat Scorecard. That's something we recommend for other people to have a look at. It's a way to go back and give your site a score, how well it's supporting the habitat pollinators. So you don't need to have any knowledge of pollinators themselves, but there's three different tiers. So you don't necessarily have to have a high level of botanical knowledge to complete those, which is kind of nice. So this is a bit more about the Habitat Scorecard. So basically it's a plot design where you're collecting information. You can do it with an online app now when you're out in the field using Survey 123, and then it'll feed the data right back to your database, which is kind of handy. And we've just joined up with the Rights of Way group. We just announced the other day that we're part of the created the Canadian chapter to join the American group. So that's very exciting for us. So I thought I'd give a few examples of costs, because people are always wondering what it's going to cost. So this is a first example of like a larger square rectangular site. It was partly clayed, had about 5.4 hectares, mix of 18 species. And the site they grew and they harvested the Roundup Ready corn. So this site is showing you the site just after the corn had been harvested, and then they'll go in and do the seeding. So the seed mix cost with the drill seeding, so that's including the labor, about $25,000. So that comes out to about $4,000 a hectare. So again, you could use that number to scale up or scale down based on your site.
Tracey, I apologize for interrupting, but I just wanted to say that we're coming close to time.
Okay. Okay, I will clip through these fairly fast. So these will be here to have a look at later, but so this is another site where it was broadcast seed. So the seed cost was about $25,000, but this also included pelletizing, so creating a coating on some of the seeds. And there was some site prep, including grinding woody material. And then this is a roadside, so you're going to approach your roadsides a little different. This one was hydro-seeded, so it gives you an idea of the costs. And then here's just some method of how you approach hand seeding on roadways. And this is an actual site in Lanark County, so you can have a sense of what it looks like after. It's quite nice. People really like to see that view as they're driving along. This is a bit about seed mix costs, so they can be very variable, but plan between $165 to $300 a kilogram. And you can look for our native seed lists on our website, and we have a lovely guide as well. And there are ways to do this without without herbicides. Some of the great publications out there from the Monarch Joint Venture and Zero Seed Society have some really great guides. Again, if you're going to do this, you're going to need a lot of planning and thought from the beginning to plan it out. And a bit about ways you can save. So whether you're going to use volunteers, whether you might reduce your amount of seed, maybe you collect your own seed and plan to do the seeding the following year, or reducing your PLS or increasing it, either way. So some of the resources that you can go and have a look at, there's the ZRC website. Pollinator Partnership has a great website where you can go and put your postal code in, and it'll give you a list of all the species that are native to your region that are supportive for pollinators. There's a YouTube channel that I think is really great. It's the Bee and Butterfly Partnership, and he has a bunch of mini videos about all the different steps of pollinator habitat. So just keeping in mind the species are going to be American focused, so you'll have to consider that as well. So here's just a picture of our pollinator guide that's helpful. And then questions.
Thank you so much, Tracey. Really appreciate that. I just want to share with everyone that these sessions are recorded as well, and they will be posted on our webpage. So if you did want to go back and take a look at any of the slides, you'll be able to do that. Tracey, we have a number of questions here. Many are focused on seeds. So I'm just going to ask one for now, and then also because our next speaker will be continuing the discussion on seeds, some of the questions might pop up there, or you can also write in the chat. So we have a question here. What is the benefit of pelletizing the seed, and what is the coating made out of?
So I'll answer the benefits part. For the ingredients of the coating, you'd have to talk to the producers themselves, but the benefits are that it combines a bunch of seeds together, particularly the fine little forb seeds that are very tiny that tend to spread out, don't get mixed very well, don't get good seed to soil contact. So by pelletizing them, they keep them close to the ground, and it will slowly be released and be better soil to seed contact. It's good for sites where it's really windy, where seed might blow around a lot, where you're worried about erosion, places where maybe you're going to go there once, say a far remote site, and you're not going to be back. It's a good way to sort of protect those seeds. Also, if there's predation, like if you're expecting a lot of deer or a lot of birds to come and pick up the seed, it's a good way to keep that seed contained till it gets into the soil. But it is an additional cost, so it's something that you have to weigh whether it's worth it for your project.
Thank you so much, Tracey. So like I said, there's a number of questions there, but maybe if it's possible to type them in so everyone can have their answer.
Sure.
And I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to move ahead. And let's see here. There we go. And as I mentioned, we're going to continue our discussion on native seeds and native seed mixes here with Paula Berketo, who's the principal landscape architect with the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. And she has been in this position since October 2010. And she assists the environmental planners and the engineers with any designs that involve the green space along the edge of the provincial highways. And with over 16,000 kilometers of highways in Ontario, that is a lot of green space. So there's 5 regional offices in the province, and each has their own specific needs pertaining to horticulture, habitat creation, and exposed soil protection. And Paula is in charge of the specifications pertaining to vegetative cover, planting, topsoil, and tree protection. So I'm going to pass things on to Paula to share her screen.
All right, is that screen up?
I think there's just a little delay here. It's just showing a blank screen. Could you perhaps try again? There we go. We can see it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's especially nice to see some people that I've worked with in the past. I haven't spoken to Nancy in a long time, and I could listen to your words for hours and hours because I always find them so interesting. And as well, it was a pleasure to listen to you, Tracey. I see that both of you actually should come and work with me because I really could use your help on things. I'd like to share with you today some things that we have been doing at the ministry, and it's not such an easy task. Although it's wonderful to hear these presentations about what should be planted along the edge of the highways, there's some, yes, political challenges in terms of how we do things, as well as the budgetary constraints that we are dealing with. So I'm glad to say that I think we've made good progress recently in terms of doing some further research, further to actually what Nancy did, I think before my time with the ministry, which is 10 years ago, in terms of documents that were prepared that talked about getting native seeds and pollinators back onto the highway right-of-way. The challenge for us is that we've got a number of challenges actually. The primary one is that the soils that we're dealing with along the highways and the conditions which things have to grow are absolutely horrendous, which is why we should be pushing more for these types of seed mixes, because a lot of them do well in really poor soils. I think the average home gardener or perhaps an engineer who works for the ministry might think that, well, we need to have garden type soils that you would have in your backyard for your vegetable garden. So something that is really rich in humus and has a lot of organic matter and nutrients in it and a good depth of soil. I've seen time and time again where seeding has been done basically almost like an Alvar community on a rock outcropping. I mean, there might be a few grains of soil, and miraculously, a number of years later, we do get some really good vegetation coming up. We've also got some of the pressures that are being put on us by some of the other ministries, and not just by the ministries, but anybody who's environmentally conscious, in terms of recreating habitats that once existed. The highway philosophy is just to plow and burn sort of thing, just tear down anything that's in your way and then start laying down asphalt and building bridges, and then you're done. But interestingly, of all of those kilometers of highways that I indicated in my introduction,
It appears we're having some technical issues. Paula, we're unable to hear you. Are you able to hear us, Paula? Okay. Thank you everyone for your patience today. Perhaps we can do a little change while I can see how Paula is doing. Jennifer, I'm wondering if perhaps you would mind continuing on. First, I think what I'll do is let me share my screen here while we wait to see if we can get Paula to connect. Oh, hold on here. Okay, so I think what we'll do, if you're set, Jennifer, while we're trying to see how Paula is doing. Oh. There we go. Is maybe we'll have you get started, and then if Paula can connect again, we'll have her continue on later on. Jennifer is the Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist, Midwest Great Plains Rights of Way Lead for the Xerces Society. And Jennifer provides resources and training for pollinator and beneficial insect habitat management and restoration in a variety of landscapes. So she oversees a team of 4 USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service partners, biologists, and she works closely with the NRCS. And Jennifer has authored a number of publications and articles and is co-author of several books, including Farming with Native Beneficial Insects, 100 Plants to Feed the Bees, and a Roadside Vegetation Manual. So I'm going to pass things on to you, Jennifer. Sorry, Jennifer, thank you.
Victoria. All right, let me get things loaded up. All right, well, thanks everybody. I'm happy to be here today. I'm talking about roadsides and their role in monarch butterfly conservation. And monarchs are such a unique animal. It's really nice to be able to focus in on them, and they're really interesting biology. I'm going to start by talking about their life cycle really briefly. Monarchs have 4 stages. They start out as an egg. These beautiful pearlescent eggs are laid on milkweeds. We're related milkweed species. And in Canada, much of monarch breeding takes place in May throughout August. And after about 5 days, the eggs hatch into caterpillars. And caterpillars start chowing down on milkweeds and milkweed-related species, and they will munch through the leaves, through the stems, through the flowers, whatever is available to put on a ton of weight. And they are in the caterpillar stage for about 14 days. And milkweeds are the obligate host plant of monarch butterflies, as well as a few relatives, especially things like honeyvine. Milkweeds are known for their milky sap, and that sap contains a compound called cardamaloids. Those are chemicals that are sequestered within the monarch caterpillars when they consume milkweeds, and that makes them pretty distasteful to predators, particularly to birds. So once a bird has tasted a monarch butterfly, they tend to steer clear. And there are about 14 species of milkweeds, which are plants in the genus Asclepias, found in Canada. There are milkweeds that do quite well in well-drained soil, like Asclepias tuberosa or butterfly milkweed, which is in the far right corner. There are milkweeds that do really well in moist soil, like swamp milkweed or Asclepias incarnata, which is in the top center. So there's a bunch of different milkweeds that can thrive in different places. They can be in conservative plant communities, and they can be in disturbance-tolerant plant communities. So once the caterpillar has reached its ideal weight, it will find a place to spin its chrysalis, and will rearrange its bodily tissues within that chrysalis over the period of about 10 to 14 days, and will emerge as an adult. The adult stage is the one that we are most familiar with. It's so visible, and adults last, typically the adults that you see in Canada and that I see where I'm based in Nebraska are have a shorter lifespan of about 2 to 6 weeks. Those are the breeding generations, but there's another generation, the overwintering generation. That's the individuals that fly to overwintering sites, and they have a much longer lifespan of about 9 months. And while monarchs are adults, they consume nectar. That's their primary source of energy, and it provides fuel for their breeding activities and for their flight. It's really critical since they make such a long distance migration. So nectar can come from a variety of wildflowers, or it can come from trees or flowering shrubs. And monarchs are true migratory species. just an individual that you might see in Toronto, for example, will travel about 3,000 miles during its lifespan. And it all starts with, there's two populations that are found here in North America. There's one found east of the Rocky Mountains, or roughly east of the Rocky Mountains. Those individuals migrate to fir trees found in a mountainous part of Mexico, and they overwinter in clusters on those fir trees. About this time of year, they start to move north, depending on conditions. So they leave their overwintering grounds and they start to breed in the southern United States. That generation, their offspring, then goes on to repopulate the rest of the United States and parts of Canada. So there's several generations between the overwintering generation. And then in the fall, there's a trigger, and those individuals that overwinter will enter a reproductive diapause and will make their long distance journey south. In the Western United States, those butterflies overwinter in colonies found in trees along California's coast, and they reoccupy and move into the Intermountain West and into the Southwest, and into Montana and up into northern Canada, or southern Canada, excuse me. So this is an amazing, iconic species that has been fairly ubiquitous across North America for a long time. But in the last 20 years or so, there's been some documented declines that have been really concerning. This is a graph that shows just the eastern population, the population that overwinters in Mexico, and the way that that population numbers is estimated is by the area that they occupy in those overwintering grounds. So it's by hectare of forest occupied by butterflies. And you can see that the numbers are steadily declined. Scientists estimate that for a stable population of the eastern monarch, that we need to see about 6 hectares of butterflies occupied in overwintering habitat regularly. And you can see that that's a number that we've hit only once in the last 20 years. So this has researchers concerned that there's a chance that the eastern migration could disappear in the future. The western population is smaller than the eastern population, so it's possible to directly count individual butterflies rather than just estimating their overwintering area. And those counts have been done for decades by dedicated volunteers who visit a number of different sites in California. And you can see too that the Western monarch decline is extremely noticeable and persistent over time. And particularly concerning and striking is a huge decline that happened between 2017 and 2018, when numbers were about 200,000 in 2017, and in 2018, just under 30,000. So underwent quite a big bottleneck. And then from 2019, when numbers were again about 30,000, dropped down to just under 2,000. So this winter, for the first time, we found under 2,000 butterflies, despite the fact that we continue to monitor a large number of sites to try to find these overwintering butterflies. So this is a really catastrophic decline in Western monarchs. And that's really where roadsides and utility corridors can play a critical role. There was a study that came out in 2017 that found that in order to get enough monarch habitat on the landscape to support monarchs at a threshold at which these migrations would be stable, we need to be thinking about integrating milkweeds in cities and in gardens, on agricultural lands, on utility corridors, and on roadsides, and that any one of those sectors cannot contribute enough milkweed to bring back monarchs. It has to be really all hands on deck. And roadsides, as well as utility corridors, provide monarchs with habitat in a couple really key ways. They can be breeding sites for monarchs. Milkweeds, as I mentioned before, can be fairly disturbance tolerant, so they can really be quite abundant on some roadsides that get more disturbance. But there are also roadsides that have intact plant communities where other milkweeds thrive as well. So their host plants are found on roadsides, and monarchs can complete multiple generations a year on roadside plants. The adults also utilize nectar plants that are found on roadsides. And then lastly, roadsides can serve as a way for monarchs to move through the landscape. They provide connectivity between patches of habitat. And for a species that's so mobile like monarchs, this is an important aspect. It's important to note that not all roadsides are equally valuable to monarchs. The plant community composition plays a really important role in the ability of a monarch to use it. If you've got a roadside that's dominated by Kentucky bluestem or another introduced full season grass, there's nothing there for monarchs to use either for the caterpillar or for the adult. But even if you have quite a diverse plant community, the method of vegetation management can also influence the amount of flowers and monarchs on roadsides. What you see in this picture here is a roadside in Kansas that's been mowed consistently quite regularly over time, again and again, such that there hasn't been an opportunity for flowering plants and other species to grow and to reproduce, to bloom. So that's over time reduced the diversity in the plant community significantly. And it means that, again, monarchs don't have a place to find food. So there are a couple of ways to think about adjusting management practices for these landscapes. Thinking about adjusting mowing practices, reducing the frequency of mowing that happens from fence line to fence line. So that's in particular the area that's beyond the regularly mown safety or clear zone. And depending on where you are and the type of precipitation, the amount of precipitation that you get, this can mean that maybe your climate and in the context also of the other management issues that you need to keep in mind, it might mean that you can reduce mowing to once a growing season or even every other year, depending on other plant pressures. This allows flowering plants to persist while monarchs are adults and milkweeds around so that they can breed. And considering the timing of when you mow is also something to keep in mind so that you can balance all your other management needs and try to keep in context what monarchs need as well. And a way to visualize how to think about how to balance the timing of mowing is this really nice management window diagram that was developed by some of my colleagues at Xerces Society and our partners at Monarch Joint Venture. Before I dive into it, I just wanted to mention that there's recently been data from you all in Canada that has been given to us to incorporate. So this management timing recommendations will be expanded for Canada in the next few months. My colleague who's working on it underway doesn't have it available today. But how this works really is to find your location. So for example, if you're here in Toronto, you would be thinking of avoiding mowing outside of October to May 1st. So management could take place between October and May 1st without any mortality for monarchs. But then between May 1st and October 1st, during the key growing months where monarchs are breeding actively and or migrating, you'd want to avoid mowing, for example, as much as possible, with the exception of there's usually a period in the middle of the summer in late June or early July when a mow poses less risk to monarchs. And it has a side benefit in some cases of rejuvenating milkweeds, especially common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, seems to be stimulated by a midsummer mow and produces new growth, which monarchs really like at that time of the year. Just a quick example of how some states here in the United States have adjusted their mowing practices to accommodate monarch butterflies. The state of Illinois decided to take a single pass in their safety clear zone with their mower, so they widened that clear zone, but then they chose to reduce mowing and the rest of the roadside to the fence line and just mow it once a year in autumn after the first frost, after monarchs have come through, and have noted in that time more milkweed stems and more wildflowers. In Kansas, they had budget cuts that dictated they needed to reduce mowing for other purposes other than monarchs, but noted that when they did, they had quite a few other wildflowers flourish over time. Another management consideration is reducing the impact of herbicides on monarchs. Obviously, herbicides are incredibly critical role for managing these spaces. Using selective applications of them or selective products and targeting their use is really important to keep the impacts of herbicides on target on your weeds. Timing them for when those applications can have the maximum impact on the weed, and recognizing weeds and being able to differentiate valuable species that might look similarly. The species that's pictured here is tall thistle, Cirsium altissimum, which isn't a species that's found in Canada, but another important native thistle in Canada is Cirsium discolor. And both of those species bloom in late summer, really critical nectar sources for monarch butterflies. In fact, here where I am in Nebraska, it's the #1 nectar source for migrating butterflies, monarchs. But it's easily mistaken for invasive noxious thistles. And so differentiating between native thistles that pose no conservation risk and noxious weeds that do pose a risk is a critical aspect of applying herbicides. And it's already been covered, revegetation, really sufficiently, but I wanted to mention that it's also an important aspect of monarch conservation on roadsides. Anytime you think about revegetating roadsides, prioritizing native plants, and as another person mentioned, prioritizing local growers or ecoregional sources of native plants is really critical. Increasing the diversity of flowering species whenever possible. Selecting your flowering plants so that they've got bloom times that overlap and are throughout the season, so that you've got food for monarchs when they arrive in the spring and throughout until they leave in the early autumn. And then lastly, incorporating milkweeds, regionally appropriate milkweeds into your seed mixes and plantings as well. There's a couple resources that are out there, and these are US based, and so there's that context there, but the principles apply. You can check out the Federal Highways Administration website for best management practices and other guidance. And then nativerevegetation.org hosts a really nice native plant selection tool, which does have data on Canada incorporated in it, as well as this roadside revegetation manual. I want to end by just mentioning quickly, I'm with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and we are a nonprofit organization that's based here in the US, but we do work throughout North America and also in different parts of the world, and really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all today. Xerces does have a number of resources, and I saw a couple of folks have mentioned them already, which I'm really grateful for. There's many available for free to download on our website. In case you are totally hooked on thistles, there's more information out there on thistles. We also have a new book, 100 Plants to Feed the Monarch, that will be available later this month. We have developed a couple different resources that are monarch specific in conjunction with partners from Monarch Joint Venture and the National Wildlife Federation. And we've got, again, these are US based, but are really relevant to Canada. For example, Milkweed of the Northeast is relevant to Ontario as well. And this just highlights the most common milkweeds that you would find on roadsides, both intact plant communities and more disturbance tolerant plant communities. And then we also have nectar plant lists from known observations of monarchs feeding on different wildflower and shrub species, in case those are of interest as well. We do have a plant database, so something that might be worth exploring is figuring out how we can use our existing plant database for URAL to support your work in Canada as well. And lastly, we have a milkweed seed finder tool. This is just to help people looking to obtain milkweed seed. And we do have a few Canadian vendors through that tool as well. And lastly, Xerces is a nonprofit. We get our funding from a variety of sources, and I wanted to say thank you, particularly to our members who help support our conservation work. And that's it from me. My email address is up there at the top, and I think I have hope I have a few minutes for questions. What do you think, Victoria?
Jennifer, you're there?
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like Victoria's having some issues on her end, so just wanted to thank you very much for that presentation. And we'll just have a look here in the Q&A.
Sure.
We have one question here. Oh, two questions. Okay. Jennifer, question. Do monarchs have preferred areas where they pupate? Is this specific to milkweed as well, or would they do well in shrubs or trees?
Yeah, they tend to pupate more lower to the ground, but they don't usually pupate on milkweed. And so they do need some other vegetation out there. And actually, some interesting findings is that monarchs tend to prefer gardens, laying their eggs within milkweeds, within gardens that are very diverse. So that might have something to do with providing future habitat for their offspring or finding ideal conditions for pupation.
Awesome. Second question, I found monarchs preferred bull thistle over everything by mid-August. Do you think this indicates a lack of other resources, or do thistles have a lot of nectar?
Yeah, excellent question. And it could definitely depend on the context in which that bull thistle grows. If there's not much else growing, I could see that it could be a magnet. But overall, yes, thistles are mega producers of nectar, and they are, I think I mentioned that tall thistle is the most important nectar source in surveys here in eastern Nebraska. Even though there are some other things growing, it's tall thistle that monarchs prefer. So there's something about that nectar at that time of season that they really, really value. But I'm not trying to put in a commercial for bull thistle, because get that out there if you need to.
Right. Our big one here is Canada thistle, which is everywhere, which of course all the pollinators love, but it's on the Weed Act. Yeah. Great. Thank you for answering all those. And thank you again for your time, Jennifer. That was very helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. And I think we have Paula back online. Paula, are you ready to jump back in?
I am. Can you hear me this time?
I can.
Skip my introduction since you already went through that, and see if I can get the presentation up.
Great.
So sorry about that before. It's terribly frustrating as a speaker to know you said such beautiful words and they weren't even heard by anyone.
Right.
Just let me know when that screen comes up.
Looks like it's up now, ready to go.
So I'll just be going through with you fairly quickly, because I understand the time, what MTO is trying to do to improve their species diversity and their planting of native seeds. I think we've done a really good job in the past 10 years or so in terms of making sure that we're looking at native species in our woody plant selection, but that hasn't always been true in our turf grass selection. And many of our turf grasses do not do well. If you've driven down sections of the new 412 in the past few years, you will have seen where it's been hydroseeded, but the seed just hasn't taken for whatever reason. It's the wrong seed, probably, one of the reasons. And so what we're trying to look at is reintroducing some of the native perennial herbaceous seeds that might have been here before the highways were even put in. And I'm just going to go through a presentation with you that was put together by somebody in our East region. And wouldn't you know it, I can't get my screen to go forward now, just nothing but frustration. I might just have to do this whole thing speaking. All right, so why do we use native seeds? And I'm sure most of you are aware of that because you all seem really well versed in seed use. But generally on our highways, our soils are very, very poor. And I always say they are akin to styrofoam in that they really don't have much nutrient value to them. There's not a lot of organic matter. There's been no development of the humus layer. And the soil itself is, it could be fairly non-existent in that all the topsoil has been stripped off, and I'm not sure really where it goes because it often doesn't come back to the site. And the soils that we have there are really degraded, difficult soils. And a testament to that is the amount of Phragmites that we're having to deal with because it thrives in those conditions. So what we'd like to do is shift to more native seed species to be used because they tend to do really well in those types of soils. And in locations where we might only have an inch of soil maybe, they even manage to do well in that. So it's wonderful. The native seed species have very deep, or the native seeds, they have very deep root systems. This is ideal because we're looking at ways to stabilize the soils. We have to deal with very steep slopes. It's very costly to move extra soil off of the site when they're building a new road or widening. And we also have problems in that when the soils have been exposed, even if you put a hydraulic mulch like a bonded fiber matrix over top, sometimes you can have such severe storm weather events that it undercuts the matrix itself and it washes everything out. So the more we can get plants in there that have deep root systems, the better. But of course, with the native seeds, they do take time to establish. So we have to get creative in how to hold the soils in place. Any of the large, dense species that come up, particularly some of the grasses, they work really well as a native barrier to snow drifting. And we've got that problem, especially out in our east and west regions where it's very, very flat in locations. And the wind just whips across the open fields and creates very severe driver visibility problems. And of course, all of these seed species that we've talked about today are really good for increasing the native habitat and pollinator species. We've worked with a wide range of contributors in terms of working through what our seed mixes are, as well as people who've helped us quite generously in the past. I'm going to mention Nancy, because Nancy, I've got your documents on my bookshelves right beside my desk at work, and I refer to them quite often. So we're so thankful for that. In terms of the types of soils that we're dealing with, we can classify them as being poorly drained soils or well-drained soils. And this almost seems to be more of a prerequisite than the type of soil, whether it's a clay loam, a sandy loam, whatever, and it's organic matter, because the native seeds do well in very poor soils. But we do have to pay attention to whether it's well-drained or not so well-drained. And I like that some of the speakers mentioned the different types of milkweed that do well, whether it's a little bit on the wet side or a little bit on the dry side. In terms of how the province is divided in the ministry's mind, we are divided into regions, 5 regions basically. There's the Thunder Bay region, and that's anything north of Lake Superior, the North Bay region, which stretches from North Bay down to Huntsville and all the way across to Ottawa. And then we have 3 regions in the south. The West region includes Niagara and basically is a straight line going north until it meets up with the Northeast region. We've got our central region, which is probably the second smallest region, and that goes from Huntsville and then continues down south until it meets up with West region. And then our East region includes the areas that are in the Kingston, Ottawa, Cornwall areas. So in these locations, we've looked at different seed mixes from poorly drained soil mixes to mixes for the East and the West, and then a pollinator reclamation mix. And I won't go through the specific percentages in the seed mixes and the different seed weights, but this gives you a general idea of the types of species that we're looking at. And these species are all, I love them because they're all beautiful as well. So it's really good for creating a pleasant driving experience. And this is something that as a landscape architect, I really try and help our engineers understand. It's not just a matter of getting from point A to point B as quickly as you can. It's a matter of making that driving experience pleasant and memorable for drivers so that you can start to develop a connection. I talk to my kids about this all the time, and it just goes right over their head because their connection is looking down at their cell phone while we're driving. And I mean, how many people of that age, my kids are less than 25 years old, they really don't have a good understanding of the landmarks along the way. And this is something to me that's very important. So we've got very quick to establish species. This helps to keep the longer to establish seed species in place. Warm season and cool season grasses. Many of the common wildflowers, or the forb and the forbs, and salt tolerant species, of course, although sometimes we get lucky and we're able to locate these things out of the way of salt drainage or salt spray. Some uncommon wildflowers to add more diversity to the mix. And then of course, species for wet conditions or dry conditions. Now the establishment and maintenance is a bit more of a challenge on our roadsides. We have to make sure that we're cutting at the right time. And Ontario is actually leading in this regard compared to some of the United States Departments of Transportation, where they're a little bit more aggressive in terms of their maintenance schedule. And many, many years ago, geez, long before I started with the ministry, we went to almost a no-cut policy. So there are places in the right-of-way that haven't been cut in decades. We do tend to cut closer to the clear zone that's been referred to. That's the shoulder and some extra space in case your car loses control. And perhaps in the medians down the center. And the illustration on the right shows you something that's cutting in a drainage path. So we need to make sure that those are clear and easy to drain. But in the left-hand illustration where we've got an upward slope, it's unlikely that we would be in there maintaining that and mowing it. We don't need to do prescribed burns. They get to be very tricky in terms of how we handle them, both in terms of a public perception of what's going on, and also in terms of a safety value, because there's just so many factors you have to keep into consideration. And if the wind changes direction and interferes with the traffic on the highway, that's of great concern, of course. No, I don't think the other are nurse crops. The ministry always uses nurse crops with things. These are crops that establish very, very quickly, and they allow the seeds that take a little bit more time to have some protection. They might need to be protected for a year or maybe 2 years. So the combination of the nurse crops and the hydraulically applied mulches or matrices really give the seed a little bit more protection. It was always said in the ministry, well and good to talk about bringing on all of these native species and flowers, but how will we actually source these things? And some time ago, it was perhaps a little bit more difficult. When I graduated from the University of Guelph in 1989, there was no heavy duty talk about native woody species, and we were encouraged to plant. Now, if you look in nursery catalogs, those species can still be found, but they're just not used. And all of the other native species that you just couldn't typically find are much more readily available. And the same holds true with the seed species. Seed, unlike a lot of the woody plants, can't be held over year after year as they could in a nursery. So certainly I understand that the seed suppliers really have to have a good understanding. They have to be well informed in terms of what a large seed user such as the ministry might like to use, so that they can prepare and take the time to collect. So I'll reverse that. And that's our last slide. I sort of whizzed through that to make up some time in case there is time for any questions.
Thank you so much, Paula. That's really fantastic. We do have a few questions here. Oh, sorry, my screen, there we go. Okay, so one of the questions we have here is targeted to both you and also Tracey, if you have any insight to add. But do you worry about premature germination with fall seeding? And what would you be looking for as the right time to fall seed? So not the dates, but just, characteristics in general.
Generally, we tend to prefer fall seeding because we have adequate moisture. The soil temperature is more reliable than it is in the spring. Often in the spring, it's difficult to get in and work because of the soggy soils. And so by the time the soils have dried out and we can get in there and do our work, it's often an ill-advised time to do seeding. So we do tend to prefer sort of earlier fall, I would say. If we tend to go a little bit later in the fall, then it's just almost like a dormant seeding situation. And since some of the seeds need to be winter scarified anyways, not scarified, why have I lost my memory in terms of what that word is, stratified, then later fall is a little bit better. The big challenge with the ministry is that we can't be so picky in terms of when we seed. The seeding is a very minute portion of a total contract dollar value. So when the contract is finished and they're ready to go ahead and do seeding, then they go. And oftentimes that is the middle of the summer. So that is why things like mulches to provide cover and the hydraulically applied mulches, which give them a little bit of protection from drying out, are something that we tend to use. Tracey?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think where May's coming from is talking about the prairies as well. And basically in the prairies, you're going to try and seed up to when the ground freezes. So that's going to vary greatly depending on the season and the area you are and the condition that you're in. So you can also do something called frost seeding. So earlier into about this time, February, March, when the ground, you're starting to see a bit of frost heave, defrost, frost back and forth. That's also a time when you can do some fall seeding. But no, we really don't worry about much germinating in the fall with our conditions. It's just plants are not really going to do that unless you're planting, say, winter wheat as a cover. None of the natives are really going to take off in the fall.
And I have another question here that I'm going to pose to everyone actually. And Paula, maybe you have knowledge from the MTO perspective, but has anyone done an economic analysis of traditional roadside vegetation management, so mowing and so on, versus actual habitat restoration and maybe focus on pollinators? Projects such, that are focused on that. And there's just a comment here, unfortunately, road departments are there to maintain the roads first and foremost, not to create habitat. So I'm just curious if anyone knows.
I think the ministry has probably done something like that through our maintenance department, which I'm not really involved with, as much. I would say that because we don't tend to extensively mow, which is a high cost item, that they've already saved so much money in terms of doing that. But if we have to go in and look at some specialized treatment for areas that we are trying to get establishment, that it wouldn't be a problem in terms of the cost of it. And it would certainly be really a good thing for many different departments in the ministry to understand that we're not just talking about planting geraniums and marigolds. This is something very different. It's not the Niagara Parks botanical garden type of look. And there's many other benefits to it, benefits that are really being encouraged by other ministries. And we've actually had to commit to making headway in terms of increasing pollinator habitat or diversity of species through the Ministry of the Environment.
And if I could add a comment too, when the ministry quit doing shoulder or fence line to fence line mowing, which happened probably the 80s to 90s, that's when you saw a lot of development. Like they did a lot of habitat restoration just naturally there. Like a lot of the plants that you see came up and thrived then, if they weren't already there. Like Central Ontario, they were probably already there. And then the other thing, there actually was a study done in MTO probably in the 70s on how long naturalization took. So if you leave a site bare or just with minimal preparation, I think it took like about 5 years before you got naturalization coming in to reseed it. But it does happen. And because there's seed sources and that, it all comes in.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that this is something that's come up a lot. And so we're working with our partnership there with the Rights of Way Habitat Group, trying to come up with a little bit of a task force to look at that question and how we can analyze the inputs of costs and what the results are. I do know that just even passive projects where you just decide you're not going to mow a stretch is another approach without actually having to plant anything. And in one example in the States, they saved about $1,000 a mile by just doing that, by reducing that mowing. So it doesn't have to be a complete restoration. You can start small with sort of passive work as well.
If I could just add to that, I love what you both have said, because you reminded me of something that I think I was blathering on about when my speaker wasn't on, which was that, yeah, the ministry doesn't maintain, and just naturally we've managed to see a lot of species come forward again. For example, milkweed, many interchanges. I love milkweed because it's so obvious in that it's so dark. The leaves are so dark, and it stands out from many other wildflowers that come up. So where some of the US Departments of Transportation might be able to say, well, we've got this massive wildflower planting schedule that we follow every year, we can't say that right now, but we can say, we haven't cut for 20 or 30 years, and look at the benefit of it. So it's a good sort of just by happenstance, you know, thing.
And look at our late fall or late summer, fall wildflower show everywhere.
Pretty much, yep.
For sure.
All right. Thank you so much, Paula. That was really fantastic. And I appreciate you persevering through technical issues. I know I was also having some technical issues. And that's just what happens when we're in this virtual world. But I'm really glad that you were able to get connected again and to continue on and share with us your expertise today. And I also just wanted to take the time to thank you, Nancy, Jennifer, and Tracy, for joining us. There was so much really, really helpful practical knowledge in here for our rights of way managers that are on our workshop today, to help them get started with whether it's restoration projects that they're planning, that they're hoping to do in the future, or maybe that they're even working on now. I know that that's going to be really, really helpful for everyone. So I really appreciate that. And again, we will have this recording up on our website shortly. So thank you everyone for attending today. When you do close out of the session today, we do have a survey that we would greatly appreciate if you could take a few minutes to fill out. It's going to help give us information on how we can conduct our future workshops. If you've done one before from one of our previous sessions, this one is a little bit different, so please do take a look. And I also just want to thank our funders, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, for making this workshop possible today. So thank you all for sticking with us today and coming to learn more about rights of way. All right, thanks.